So even with the huge nerfs that came with the recent Diablo 4 patch, the Druid still looks to be holding up quite strongly. Alright, let's try that again, shall we? So at least relative to the other classes it seems, the Druid has gone away, I guess relatively with fewer nerfs, and it does seem like some of their new weaknesses can be at least somewhat shored up by the new Malignant Hearts coming in Season 1, although of course my heart goes out to the more casual players who don't necessarily want to play Season 1 or feel like they've been robbed of all their progress that we've accrued up to this point. But if you still would like to give Season 1 a try, I honestly believe that the Druid is going to be a great choice. Although one of their weaknesses, I suppose, is their leveling had felt somewhat slow and a bit clunky, especially if you don't pick up some of the right legendary powers that especially enable certain builds like Pulverize and Tornado. And some have even described the Druid leveling and progression experience to sort of be like a roguelike in and of itself, which is you sort of adapt your build according to what you pick up, say the legendary powers that you get or even the uniques that you get. Of course, like the Tempest Roar and the Great Staff of the Crone, although those are more like endgame items. And this sort of style can be fun in some ways, but it can also be unfun if you really want to play a specific build and just can't get that specific, say, legendary aspect to drop, right? However, a sort of yet unnoticed change with Season 1 that actually greatly alleviates this problem is that throughout the season journey, which is where you complete objectives to earn rewards, which can also include legendary aspects, and the aspects from the first and second chapters of this season journey are actually going to be really good ones for leveling for the Druid, and thus if you choose to use them will make the leveling experience way smoother for the Druid, even up to World Tier 3 and even getting past the Capstone Dungeons. And with that, Chapter 1 of the season journey, which is very easy to complete as you can see from the objectives here, which you don't even have to complete all of, you only have to do 7 out of the 9, will reward Druids with these new Subterranean aspect, which is an extremely powerful and useful one for Druids that choose to use Earth skills. And with Landslide being already a viable way to level up with, this will actually just make the build even stronger and shore up its main weakness, which is the lack of AoE. And since Poison Creeper is already a skill that people will take with Landslide, and also just a really powerful leveling skill in general, this will just make the build overall a lot stronger. And it actually even, as you can see, comes with 2 effects, one active and one passive, so to speak, with the active one being the AoE Landslide, and the passive one being just dealing straight up extra damage to poisoned enemies, which again, Poison Creeper will also constantly apply. And just building around this aspect and Landslide alone should actually even carry you right into World Tier 3 if you choose to do so. And along the way, as soon as you meet the minimum level requirements of the zone, you can also pick up some useful aspects like the Crash Stone aspect in the Scotland zone from the Stockades dungeon, which will give you extra critical strike damage, which Landslide has an effect where it basically guarantees a lot of critical strikes, so that's very useful. Next, you can also swing by the Feral's Den in Scotland, although you do have to clear the stronghold there first to pick up the Quicksand aspect, which will allow your Earth skills to also slow enemies, allowing you to benefit further from affixes like damage to crowd control enemies and to slowed enemies. And this even happens to synergize with the previous aspect, the Crash Stone aspect, because it does have the condition of the enemies having to be crowd controlled, which a slow is. And while in Scotland, you can also swing by the Whispering Pines to pick up the Ballistic aspect, which will give you +2 ranks to your Earth skills, resulting in a sizable damage boost. And you have to have Fortify for this to activate, but the Druid does have several sources of Fortify, such as with Earthen Bulwark and with your basic skill Earth Strike and so on and so forth. And speaking of Fortify, once you're around level 25 or so and are able to start farming the Dry Steppes, be sure to also swing by the Seaside Descent for the aspect of Retaliation, which will give you increased damage based on how much Fortify you have. And again, because Earthen Bulwark is so useful, not only for generating that Fortify, but also for barrier and survivability, of course, you'll also want to swing by the Sealed Archives, also in the Dry Steppes, to pick up the aspect of the Mending Stone. Next, for some more supplemental aspects, once you reach about level 40 and above, and are able to do Kyrgyzstan content, you'll want to swing by the Shift the Ruins to pick up the Wind Striker aspect, which will increase your movement speed on a crit, which if you're playing Landslide, you will be critting a lot, and thus will be running faster, which you should greatly appreciate, especially as a druid. And also in Kyrgyzstan, in the Halls of the Damned dungeon, we have the infamous Disobedience aspect, which although it was nerfed, it's still one of the most powerful defensive aspects, and especially one that you can indeed unlock from a dungeon. And with that, if you go for a Landslide plus Poison Creeper build relying on Subterranean aspect and other complementary Landslide aspects, this should again be able to carry you at least through the first Capstone dungeon. Just don't forget to focus on some toughness as well, such as with the Disobedience aspect, and making sure the item power on your armor is decently high, and even if you have some damage reduction, affixes that could be good, or plus max life. And then once you get into World Tier 3, I would actually only recommend sticking with this build if you manage to pick up some of the Trample Slide related aspects, namely the Trampled Earth, Aftershock, and Symbiotic aspects. With all three, you should have a decent shot in the second Capstone dungeon that'll take you into World Tier 4. And you can even continue playing this build into the endgame as well, or even pivot into some other builds like with the Exploding Earthen Bulwark. However, my personal recommendation, especially if you don't get to pick up some of these aforementioned legendary aspects that don't come from dungeons, would be to pivot into a Pulverize Druid, which does have all of its key aspects coming from either dungeons or the season journey again. It's very tanky, it's powerful, it's even endgame viable, but since a lot of players actually started with this build at the beginning or launch of Diablo 4 preseason, a lot of players are kind of tired of this build, including myself. But if you're not in that camp or haven't even tried the Druid yet, you can certainly try out, and I would recommend trying out the Pulverized Druid. And if you want, you can even change your build from Landslide or whatever you prefer into Pulverize even before the first Capstone dungeon, and it'll definitely make the first Capstone dungeon feel very easy. And essentially the way this works is even before level 30, once you complete chapter 2 of the season journey, you'll be able to earn the Shockwave aspect, which is an extremely powerful and key aspect that previously a lot of players who were trying to play Pulverize were not lucky enough to get this to drop, because it does seem like a rarer drop. But with the season journey guaranteeing this at a fairly early level, you can now go into a very consistent and powerful build with the Druid quite early on, and thus making the level experience much smoother, of course alongside the chapter 1 aspect, the Subterranean aspect, which you can even use alongside this aspect if you want. And just one thing you want to make sure to do if you do decide to pivot into Pulverize is to go over to the Belfry Zikara dungeon up in Hawazar once you're above level 30 or so, to be able to actually do this, to pick up the aspect of Earth Sign Horror, which will then turn your Pulverizes into Earth skills and allow you to benefit from all the aforementioned Earth aspects. And before I forget, one more very useful aspect, not just for the Pulverized Druid, but for most Druid builds actually, is the aspect of the Umbral for resource generation that you can pick up from the Champion's Demise in the Dry Steppes. And to wrap up, especially for those of you who are not yet as familiar with the Druid class as a whole, I just want to quickly run through some of the basics regarding some of the best skills to use and even different alternative skills that you can focus on while leveling and progressing. And I'll also run through some of the Malignant Hearts that are coming with Season 1 that I think might have potential to enhance your builds with. And I do of course want to preface this by saying that there isn't really a correct way to play or a correct answer or build to all this, because what you find the most fun and satisfying to play should be what you're going with, right? But anyhow, for some of the most popular skills that the Druids have, starting with basic skills, most people like to go with Storm Strike for the AoE and also Immobilize Invulnerable and damage reduction. Wind Shear or Earth Strike are also fine choices, as are the Wolf or Bear ones if you decide to spec into more related synergistic stuff, right? And moving on to core skills, I would say the most viable ones are again of course Pulverize, but this will usually come after you get those aforementioned aspects. And then Landslide is probably the best one early on, and again can carry you definitely through the first Capstone dungeon. Next, if you also get the Tornado, the Homing Tornado aspect, which is not a dungeon aspect, if you manage to pick it up, the Homing Tornadoes can be very strong as well. I wouldn't recommend Lightning Storm as much for leveling up because it's a channeling skill and it can be quite costly in terms of spirit, making it a bit more suitable for the end game. Next, Moving on real quick, of course Earthen Bulwark is a staple in most builds because it gives you Barrier and Unstoppable and also Fortify, which enhances not only your survivability but also damage somewhat. Poison Creeper is another skill that many builds will pick up, especially early on while leveling, because it has really good AoE, and Immobilizes actually enable your Landslides to have their guaranteed crit. And next, you generally also want to take Trample now because it already has been giving Unstoppable, and in the latest patch, it was one of the few skills that actually got buffed, giving you a bit more spirit when you cast it. The ultimates here are actually kind of personal preference. In the early game, they're actually not as impactful as they are in the late game, so you can take Petrify, which is a pretty popular one. It can give you some extra spirit. Grizzly Rage can be nice for some Fortify and Unstoppable and extra survivability and damage, especially if you're playing Pulverize, right? And then Cataclysm is actually a fine choice too if you're playing some kind of caster variant. It can just be some extra damage and also causes enemies to be vulnerable. And moving on to the key passives, similarly, a lot of them don't really work well until late game. So the general recommendation for early game and progression and leveling is to take Nature's Fury if you're playing more of a caster build like with Landslide or Tornado. And then if you're playing primarily a Pulverize bear build, you would take the Earth Sign Strength aspect for just some extra survivability and just straight up damage increase. And then as for late game really quick, of course you can transition into whatever build that you find the most enjoyable, because for the Druid especially, there are a lot of viable endgame builds. Of course Tornado and Lightning Storm and even Pulverize and Trample Slide and Poison Shred, I believe, and also Stormclaw and even Lightning Shred are all going to be viable, or are currently all viable good endgame builds. And of course the Malignant Hearts, which are special gems that are coming with the season, could also enable certain builds or alter the balance of power, so to speak. And some of the ones that I found very interesting or that I think are powerful are the following. And on screen here, and you can pause if you want, these are first of all the offensive ones that I found to be quite strong, or sound like they could be quite strong, but it would depend on how mechanically they actually work, especially the Barber, whether or not it actually damages the main target that you're hitting. Another one I found very interesting is Determination, which is a utility and more specifically resource type gem, which it says that resource draining effects are 40 to 50% less effective, which if this actually affects channeling spells like Lightning Storm, it can actually make Lightning Storm a even more powerful build and one that can be very viable for leveling too. Another one that I found could be quite interesting, depending on how the mechanic actually works, is Revenge, which sounds like a straight up damage reduction gem, although I'm not sure whether the explosion would actually damage your own character as well. Hopefully it doesn't, and I don't think it would, but this could definitely help offset some of the defensive nerfs on item affixes that we saw with the patch. And lastly here, we also have the Druid specific Malignant Hearts, and the Unconstrained Beast especially could help alleviate some of the cooldown reduction nerfs, which without it, players were keeping up Grizzly Rage nearly 90 to 100% of the time, and it was also granting them Unstoppable, right? So since that has been nerfed, this gem specifically could help offset some of that pain, and also be useful in other cases too. The first gem too, Boon Rage, sounds, although pretty meme-worthy, could actually be quite interesting if you're able to sort of summon infinite wolves, especially without having to equip the wolf skill, which again, with these defensive nerfs, could actually be useful in spawning a bunch of meat shields, especially if you're playing some kind of ranged build. And with that, that's pretty much all I want to highlight for now for the Druid, starting out leveling and progressing through the first season of Diablo 4. Now, if you also want to check out a leveling route guide in terms of the best ways to level, and not only that, but also how to collect renown efficiently with Season 1, be sure to check out my guide, linked in the description box too. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check me out on twitch.tv/LonMeasley, and I will catch you in the next video. Peace.